Welcome to this week's Message Connect. We're in part 5 of our series called The Life of David. And we've had an interesting journey so far to see how God has taken David from the shepherd boy to now we're going to find out that David is king of Israel. Now, if you'd like to hear this message in its entirety, you can go to ringochurch.com and download the podcast and listen to it. Or you can go to our Ringo Church app and listen to the podcast there as well. Today we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. The Bible is a fascinating book. It's amazing how it tells the entire story of individuals. In fact, one writer says the Bible tells the truth about people. The Bible really is transparent about people's lives. The Bible tells the truth about people, and one of the signs of that is authenticity. If all these characters in the Bible were fictional, if all these characters were mythologic or just superheroes, they would never make a mistake. They would have zero weaknesses. But that is not the case with the people that we find in the Bible. The Bible is unafraid that these people, while they're very important and very important to our faith journey, they're not perfect. Even the people the Bible elevates and says, these are examples of faith. These are heroes of the Bible. Be like these people, the Bible even says. They're still obviously flawed. They made mistakes. Today, we're going to watch how David's life takes a turn. Up to this point, David had been very honorable. David had been a man of faith. He had been following God's lead each step of the way. But now he's king. The position of kingship has changed him. The position of his life has changed, and so has David's position in life. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Reba. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, I'm pregnant. You see, things were different about David. And David now has become different. What occurred when David stayed in Jerusalem while his army went off to battle? How did David try to cover up the consequences of his sin? And what was the result? Now that David was the king, he kind of felt like he arrived. Now, this is a very dangerous feeling for any of us to have. When we feel like we've arrived, we become comfortable, we become secure in our surroundings. If we have interacted with God at all, there's a difference between the way we interact with God when things are hard versus when things are good. You see, when things are difficult, when I'm in a season of challenge, if I'm going through a season of loss or pain, frustration, it's amazing how my dialogue with God is in an all-time high. I'm asking questions, I'm seeking guidance, I'm digging into the Word of God for answers. I want God's input, I want God's wisdom, I want God's direction. I want to feel His presence even more. So I'm talking to the Lord all the time. When I feel like that I've arrived and I'm comfortable or things are going pretty well, my dialogue with the Lord decreases significantly. Because I feel like everything's going pretty well. There's even kind of a amount of confidence where I kind of convince myself the reason things are going pretty well, is because of me. I've done well. So God, there's other people who need your help right now. Lord, I don't need your help right now. That's kind of the mindset we kind of get when we feel like we've arrived. Now that David was sitting on the throne, now that he had all this fame, he had this fortune, he had power, he had everything he ever wanted. He slipped into spiritual cruise control. He stopped talking to God as much. His relationship with God had kind of stalled out. And it's because things were easy. Things had become very comfortable to him. In this passage, we see that David had arrived as king of Israel, and his faith was on spiritual cruise control. Have there been times in your life when you felt like you have arrived and you were no longer depending on God? How do you keep from putting your faith on cruise control when life is going well? David was very comfortable now. He was in cruise control. The Bible says that it was the spring of the year. The armies went off to fight in the spring of the year. And the reason they would fight in the spring of the year because the weather was better and because food was more readily available for them to eat because it had been naturally growing in the fields. David has slipped into cruise control probably because he's stressed out at work. I mean, when Samuel writes this, notice what he says. He says, it just kind of happened. Did you notice how he said that in the passage we read earlier? You know, it happened one day when David went on a walk on top of the roof. There she was. It didn't say that David went out looking for temptation, but temptation found David that day. David didn't sit at his computer and Google, where can I find a naked woman on a roof? But he did see her, and David wasn't ready for this moment. When he had slipped into this spiritual cruise control, this happened a long time ago. His defenses were lowered in this moment. He wasn't ready to fight. On a better day, David might have looked away. He might have ran from the temptation. On a better day, he might have said, I've got to get off this roof. On a better day, he would have fled from this sexual temptation. But he wasn't ready to fight in that moment. He wasn't ready to fight back. You and I today, we live in a world. We live in a culture all around the world where cultures have decided that what I desire in my heart, I should have this. If I want it, I should get it because I'm a good person and I'm a naturally good person. And because of that, I desire it. It must be good. I want it. So I'm going to allow what happens in my senses is I'm going to allow my desires to become my decision makers. Now the language here in this passage is very clear. This was not the act of two consenting adults. This was a man of power, the king, and a woman who could not say no to the king. David used Bathsheba for his own sexual gratification, and then he sent her home. This was not the budding romantic relationship. This was a one-night stand in the palace. Then Bathsheba sends David a note. I'm pregnant. Now, those three words in the right relationship can provide immeasurable joy. But those three words in the wrong relationship can provide grief and anxiety. Now, God brings David, to two different paths, the fork in the road. One path is a path of recovery and redemption. He could have owned his sin. He could have reconciled with God. He could have repented. But the other road is the path called cover-up. David made the same decision that probably we have made multiple times and multiple occasions in our own personal lives. He was going to cover this up. King David's master plan was to invite Bathsheba's husband home from the battlefield, from the war front. So David brings Uriah back. He brings him into his palace, into his dining room to have dinner with him. His plan was that, he would spend time with Uriah and kind of build him up and then encourage him to go home and spend the night with his wife because he knew that they would sleep together. And then in 9 months, nobody would know anything different. The community would assume, hey, Uriah came home, he spent time with his wife, they had a baby, and Uriah would assume that's what happened, he had a baby, and Bathsheba would be ashamed to say that anything else happened, and no one would have to know. The problem was King David underestimated Uriah. In fact, Uriah's integrity was greater than King David's. He kind of looks back at the king and says, I can't do that. King David, my soldiers, they're still in the battle. They're encamped on the war front. They don't get to come home and spend time with their wives. How can I do this? Why should I spend time with my wife? And he says to David, I will not go home. David tries the next night. So what's he do? Has dinner again. This time, brings out the alcohol. David got Uriah drunk, assuming it would lower his standards, and he would have blurred vision, and he would just kind of wander his way home. But even though he had blurred vision, Uriah could still see the difference between right and wrong, and he refused to go home again. David knew that his cover-up had a time clock. He knew that it was ticking away. He knew that his window of opportunity was getting smaller and smaller and smaller to pull this off. So he pulled out his emergency plan. David wrote a note. He sealed it, and he sent it with Uriah back to the battlefield. The note was to the commander of the army, Joab. David told Joab, the next time you're engaged in battle, put Uriah right in the front line, right in the middle of danger. And when the archers start shooting their arrows, pull them back. Pull the men back, but leave Uriah there to die. That was David's plan. The king, the one who was supposed to have his people's best interest at mind, the one who's supposed to protect his soldiers, killed multiple men that day to cover up his affair. It wasn't just Uriah who died that day. There were many others. This was a dark, dark moment in the life of David. Once Bathsheba had finished her mourning the loss of her husband, David then took Bathsheba into his home as one of his wives to live with him. From the outside, everyone would have said, wow, this is an honorable thing for David to do. I mean, in that culture, someone had to step up and take care of a widow. She could not take care of herself. She was not in position to fend for herself. She didn't have a son to take care of her. Somebody had to take care of her. So from a community's perspective, it would have looked like, man, King David is a compassionate man. He took one of his hero soldiers and who died in battle and brought his wife into the palace. And he took this widow of a famed fallen warrior. What a good guy to take her into his home. David flipped what was potentially an embarrassing scandal into making him look like the champ. He fooled the community. He fooled the army, but there was one problem. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 27. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. David could pull the wool over the eyes of the community. David could fool the army, but he wasn't fooling God. God saw right through his heart. God saw through this facade that David had created. God knew his heart. David taking Bathsheba as his wife after Uriah's death seemed to be the honorable thing to do in the eyes of the community. But God was not pleased. Describe what happens in your relationship with the Lord when you cover things up instead of dealing with them. God now puts his plan into motion. He calls his prophet Nathan to step into the scene. Now, a prophet's job is to hear from God, the message that God has, and to present that message to the people, unfiltered. That was the job of a prophet. This is not a fun job, and many times it was a very difficult job, a tough job. Nathan has the unenviable job of going and confronting the king. Remember, no one says no to the king. No one confronts the king. And here comes the prophet Nathan. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. So the Lord sent Nathan, the prophet, to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb, he had bought. He raised the little lamb, and it grew up with his children. I ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day, a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. Nathan wisely confronts David with this story, a story of a man with power who abused another man who only had one thing. And apparently David didn't get the story. Either David was completely in denial, or he had lived so long now, several months, with this secret that he convinced himself it was okay. Nathan refused to allow David to ignore the obvious. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul." I can just imagine David falling back into his throne, in his throne chair, and kind of looking at Nathan with just absolute surprise. Nathan knows what David has done. David thought he pulled this off, thought he covered it up. But not only did Nathan know, God knew. And this is what we call hitting rock bottom. Nathan confronts David about his sin. And David is either in denial or he had convinced himself what he had done was okay. Have you ever lived with a secret so long that you rationalized it and were no longer convicted by it? God's message to David was clear. David, I gave you everything. I gave you the throne. I gave you power. I've given you the palace. I've given you great wealth, protection. I even promised to give you much, much more than this. And you went and took the one thing that wasn't yours. David, you messed all of this up for something that wasn't yours, and I've given you all of this. And now, all of the peace that David had been living in, all the peace that he experienced, even right within his own family, was disintegrating. David's family from this point on will be known as a dysfunctional family. They won't get along. There'll be a lot of nasty things that happen within his family because of David's bad decision, bad choice. And on top of that, God was not going to let him get away with this any longer. Nothing healthy ever grows in the dark. Sin that is left unattended does not shrink, does not dissipate, does not go away. It only grows. Nathan was willing to confront David. He confronted him about his sin, and he had David's best interest at heart. Do you have someone like Nathan in your life right now? Have you given anyone permission to call you out in your sin? If you haven't, why not? What we see at the end of the story here, David confessing his sin to God and to Nathan and eventually to Israel, was the road to freedom. It was also the road to healing. Sin always loses its power as soon as we start talking about it, confessing it. As soon as we start praying about it and we bring it to the throne of God. As soon as we start sharing it, not with just everyone, but those who are closest to us to hold us accountable. So can we together just start embracing the fact that maybe we need to start talking about some of this stuff, this mess, this sin that maybe has taken root in our lives that needs to be uprooted. It needs to be brought from the darkness into the light. Stuff that we've been avoiding to talk about for a long time that's only growing deeper and deeper and deeper in our heart. The discussion guide has been provided for you today for this Message Connect. It's basically focused on the next steps that we encourage you to take. Next steps are meant to help you to go deeper into the Word of God, deeper into this message. We want to challenge you and encourage you to take these next steps together. At Ringo, we believe that growing people change. We want to see you grow and become more like Jesus. So to do that, we need to start talking. We need to have people around us that we can talk with. We need to start thinking through this. What is God trying to say to us? What wisdom is He trying to give to us? We need to start sharing our lives with one another. We need to start praying. We believe that we are called to be a praying church. And praying is the first thing that we do, not the last reaction. And we need to start doing it. We need to walk by faith and not by sight. I want to encourage you to take these next steps and get connected. Connected with Jesus, connected with one another. God bless you.